What do Android developers wish they would have known when starting out learning Android or starting out in their careers? Now I have my thoughts, but I was curious what others in the Android developer community had to say about this. So I asked. The responses were both illuminating, supportive, and really came from developers of all experience levels. So in this video, I want to share some of those insights with you. Essentially, this video and the related blog post are going to be a community curated list of tips, tools, and tricks to help people starting out with Android. If you want to jump straight to the advice given in tweets, skip to the end. The most popular theme was centered around the idea of community. What's the community, you might ask? That's a good question. The community is you, it's me, it's anyone and everyone building for or supporting the Android platform. And the community is really powerful in a variety of ways. It is a generator of documentation. It is filled with helpful people that will answer questions and seek out answers for you. A source of support and validation. If you're struggling with something, there are other people out there that have gone through it and are there to tell you that it's okay and that you don't need to feel bad or worried about going through that struggle. It's also a place to find mentorship. It's a great way to develop as an engineer, and there's lots of people out there willing to help you along, give advice, support, point you in the right direction. And finally, the community is the builders of so many amazing tools and libraries that we use on a daily basis as Android developers. So if you're having really any kind of a problem or you have any question, the community is the best place to start to seek out that answer. This one resonates with me a lot because I wish I would have been more involved earlier on in my career. Reaching out to other developers, whether that's through social media, at meetups, at conferences, even within my own organization, it really has helped me learn to seek out answers more efficiently. It's helped me to come out of my shell and be a bit more confident with admitting, hey, I don't know the answer to this, but there's nothing wrong with that. That doesn't make me a bad developer. Let me go out and seek out this answer. It's helped me feel supported, like I have other people in my corner when I am facing these problems or when I'm trying to track down a solution. So really there's a lot of ways that being more connected in the developer community can actually help you in your day-to-day work. A lot of this idea of the community is fairly abstract. So what does it actually look like in practice? How do you get involved with the developer community? There's actually a lot of ways for that. That could be on social media. Twitter is particularly active in the Android community, but you also have Facebook or LinkedIn or Google Plus maybe still these days. You have Reddit, you have podcasts, you have YouTube channels, there are meetups, there's conferences, there's Slack, so many ways to communicate and meet other Android developers. And so I really encourage you to seek some of these out. And I know that can be scary at times because a lot of times that means putting yourself out there in a way that you're maybe not comfortable with yet. But I know from experience of my own self feeling that way, sometimes feeling terrified to send out a tweet and honestly spending 15 minutes on it, then deleting it and never even sending it. So I know from that experience that it can actually be really rewarding and that in general people are actually really awesome and want to help, they want to be supportive. And so if you do reach out, say hi to somebody, try and meet them, I think more times than not you will be pleasantly surprised and have that risk pay off for you. There's a really great blog post that I'll link to down below from Tyler McCraw about different ways of interacting with the Android community. I highly encourage you to check that out. It's a really great resource and you can come back to it again and again to maybe pick out different ways that best suit you. Do you ever sit down to write out a list of topics that you want to explore? Or maybe you just get done at a conference and you just get that deer in headlights look? Yeah, I get that too. Learning to be an Android developer is a huge challenge. part of the reason it's such a big challenge is because it doesn't stop. It just keeps on trucking. Every year there's a new I/O. Every year there's new conferences, there's new patterns, there's new features, there's new tools, there's new libraries. It doesn't end. And that is an awesome thing in general because it means the platform is growing, developing. A lot of the times it means our lives as developers are getting easier. It also means that there is a lot for us to check out, to try, to learn, to know. So how do you balance that? It's a particularly relevant question when you're just starting out with Android or in your first career, particularly because there's so many other things beyond just the core Android platform itself that you're trying to learn. You're trying to learn how to deal with a team, how to maybe work remotely, how to adhere to strict deadlines, to plan out tasks. Maybe you're learning version control or design patterns. There's just so much more besides Android itself. And so I think there are a number of things you can do to really concentrate, to focus, and to help improve your efficiency in how you learn these things over time and how you think about learning them, how you approach that so that you can be successful long term and not burn out. I remember early on in my career always feeling like I needed to be doing something, either learning or trying the newest tool or the newest library. I wanted to watch every single conference video to make sure I didn't miss anything, and that gets really overwhelming at times. So I think the number one piece of advice that I personally like to give to people when it comes to how do you stay up to date as an Android developer is you can't know everything. Another way to phrase this is nobody knows it all. There's nobody out there that knows the entirety of the platform. Even the people at Google building this stuff can't work on everything at the same time. If you're thinking that you're behind because you haven't tried every single architecture component and new tool and library, remind yourself, nobody else has done it all either. You don't need to hold yourself to that standard because it's unreasonable. Nobody can meet that. So if you can't learn everything, how do you decide what to learn, or how do you stay up to date on all of this stuff? One big thing that I think helps me is to just have an understanding of what's out there. A lot of times, if you are trying to decide how to solve a problem, the difference between immediately having an idea of how to solve it or needing to spend a lot of time researching is just having banked something away for a rainy day in the back of your mind. Maybe you know that there's some new library out there that is supposed to make a certain problem easier for you. If you're just aware of that, not necessarily how it works or if it's the best thing to be using, but just knowing that there's an option will actually go a long ways towards helping you efficiently come up with a solution to those problems because you'll immediately know where to look. A big piece of advice that I give to people is to not dive into every task, but maybe find ways to just know and be aware of what other people out there are working on or thinking about. A great way to do this is the weekly newsletter like Android Weekly, because every week you'll see a collection of posts and videos and conferences, and that'll give you a good idea of what other people are looking into. You don't have to read all of them, you don't have to dive in and try every single thing that's mentioned, but just even reading the headlines or a first paragraph will often give you a sense of what's going on in the developer community. At some point, you are going to want to dive in and more deeply explore these topics. When you do, I think the biggest piece of advice I can give is to not feel a sense of embarrassment around not knowing the answers. Don't keep yourself from asking questions or seeking out answers to your questions for fear of looking silly. There's a great quote from Craig Russell that he tweeted out that not asking questions is a good way to avoid looking silly and a great way to avoid becoming smart. I think that is so spot on, and I know I definitely have struggled with this over the years, especially earlier in my career, because I wanted to find this balance between seeking out the answers, asking lots of questions, but then on the other side also seeming like I knew what I was talking about so people didn't discover that, oh, I have no idea what's going on. Down the line, I discovered that, oh hey, that's actually called imposter syndrome, and it's totally normal, and everybody feels that at some point. But I actually didn't know that at the time. So if you feel that way and have never heard of imposter syndrome, I encourage you to look that up. You know, it's perfectly normal and expected to not have all the answers all the time. Nobody does, and so don't put that pressure on yourself. It's much better to seek out those answers to your questions than to basically waste time trying to figure out on your own and getting. Once you know what your learning priorities are, don't feel any shame or embarrassment around seeking out those answers. Everyone has a different set of skills, experiences, and backgrounds, and so they're all gonna have different questions or answers to provide. And that's part of what makes this developer community so rich and diverse and awesome, because everybody can bring their different experiences together, and collectively we can hopefully all improve together. So how do you prioritize all of these new topics that you want to explore but just don't have time to learn everything? So how do you prioritize all this stuff when there's not enough time to dive into all the new cool things? So for me, I kind of break it down into two categories. The first being things that are very relevant or applicable to work. And the second are things that just I find really personally interesting and exciting. The reason I break it up into these two categories is basically time management. So the first category, being work related, means that I feel no guilt about building time into my weekly schedule to explore this stuff. If you are evaluating a new library because you might be able to use it with work, there's nothing wrong with spending work time to do that. You might have to figure out how much time you can personally devote during any week or sprint based on your load. But I highly encourage you to try and find ways to build that time in. Maybe that is a conversation with your manager to actually block out some dedicated time, or maybe that is you just learn how to build time by how you break down and schedule your weekly work. If you can find that work time, then you don't have to give up your personal time to do that, which is huge because you shouldn't have to. You shouldn't be giving up your outside life to stay up on all the latest and greatest trends. The second category for me, which is just things that I find really personally interesting, those are things that aren't really relevant to work, but just as a topic for an engineer or for kind of a tinkerer, just things that I find really interesting. So for me right now, that is Android things. It's not that relevant to work for me, but I find it so fascinating that it's something that for me feels just like a hobby. To me, it's like playing with Legos or models or something. And so it is something that I can spend outside time on and still kind of recharge my batteries and not feel like I'm just sludging through another work day if I'm working on the weekend. So bouncing right in from learning and deciding what to learn, Jake Wharton tweeted a response to my question that got a lot of interest from the community, and I think it was a really, really good point. That is that Google doesn't always know best, and that you should evaluate their stuff the same way that you would evaluate anybody else's. Now, I think that you should extend this to really anybody and everything. So one example would be if you're a junior engineer on your team and a more senior member of the team submits a pull request and asks for a review, don't just assume that their code is always going to be correct. If you see something that looks a little off to you, speak up, raise that question. Maybe it is something that you just don't understand, in which case you'll learn from that and you'll recognize that next time. But maybe it is a case that the more senior member could have done something differently, or it could be improved in some way. And so it really benefits the entire team for you to ask those questions. The same goes for any tool or library, regardless of who wrote it, what company it's coming from. You should be thinking very, very critically of what is going into your code base and what you're going to be using. This can be a big challenge as a junior developer. One, because you maybe don't necessarily know what all to look for when you're evaluating tools and libraries, because you haven't had no experience yet. So you don't have all of the information to always draw from to decide whether something is a pro or a con. But especially when dealing with other developers on your team, it can be really intimidating to want to speak up or to have your voice heard. Oftentimes made even more challenging if the team environment isn't conducive to that. And so it actually goes both ways. I really want to encourage you to know that if you're in a team where the environment is not conducive to allowing you to speak up, or you don't feel like you are given ample opportunity to raise your concerns or to give feedback on things like code reviews, I really encourage you to have that conversation with your manager or with your team. Try and bring up ways that you can start to improve that team culture and give everybody a voice. And if you can't, then I think maybe this is another case where reaching out to the community and finding advice on your situation and what to do could be really beneficial. And on the flip side of that, if you're a more senior developer and you're in a situation where you feel that someone on your team isn't getting their voice heard or isn't speaking up, really put the onus on you to reach out to them, figure out what it is that is preventing that, and hopefully change that dynamic in your team so that everybody has a voice and can be heard, and you really start to have a more inclusive team environment where everybody is getting a chance to contribute. So developers love our tools. They make our lives so much easier. They speed up the development process. They can make testing and deployments easier, building easier. They're awesome. Developers love tools. So how do you find these tools? You can't use a tool if you don't know where it is. And so for example, a couple people mentioned Genymotion as an amazing tool that they wish they would have known when they were starting out. I wholeheartedly agree. Genymotion honestly changed my life. I used to plan my day around having a physical device to test on, and when I discovered Genymotion, I didn't have to do that anymore. I didn't have to pick up all my stuff, leave the coffee shop, and come back if I forgot my testing device. I could just use the emulator, so that was amazing. If you are wondering if there's a better way to do something, or if you're feeling a pain point and you think that it just seems like something that maybe somebody has solved, reach out to your coworkers, reach out to people online and ask if there's a solution for it. Even if you don't necessarily feel like it's a pain point, maybe just reach out to people online, in your team, in your network, just ask if they have interesting tools. A lot of times you don't even realize that something could be improved until someone points you to the magic silver bullet that suddenly fixes your workflow. Another couple examples of great tools that people wish they would have known is the Android SDK search Chrome plugin that allows you to just immediately search the SDK documentation from your browser, or Android Studio shortcuts. I particularly like the shortcuts because they really do make your day-to-day work much quicker once you start to get a few of them down. Also want to give a big plug to Git and GitHub as incredibly useful tools. I can't imagine my day-to-day life without them anymore, but I absolutely remember a time early on in my Android developer career when I had no idea what source control was. So if you're someone out there that has ever accidentally deleted a project and not had a backup, or you find yourself copying a whole directory, putting it in another place, and then starting to work on this one just in case you need to go back to this one, I highly encourage you to go check out source control, Git or GitHub. I'll link to some resources down below as well, but it will change your life, it'll change how you develop, and really, really help you out down the road. A common concern or a common question I have from people that are starting out is what architecture should they be using? Especially in Android, where we seem to be changing this constantly over the last several years. People often will ask, should I be using MVC, MVP, MVVM, now we're saying MVI. There's a lot of options out there, not to mention the greater architecture of your app as a whole, not just the UI layer. Also, then you have components to think about, activities, fragments, custom views, Java or Kotlin. Nowadays, we're also seeing, the cross-platform debate. So should you be using native code, React Native, Flutter? There's so many questions out there just regarding architectures, patterns, languages, that it's really easy to get overwhelmed. I think people often get too caught up in the philosophical debate of just deciding which one is objectively better, and sometimes we forget as engineers that we're ultimately trying to actually solve a problem and build a working product. One piece of advice I'd like to give is that it doesn't always matter which of these things you choose if at the end of the day you have correct working software. Often this choice of your patterns and your architectures is going to be made for you. Especially if you're a junior developer and you're coming into an existing team, you're probably going to inherit a large code base and you are going to have to learn whatever implementation is already there. So while it's good to be familiar with these and how they work, also recognize that every team is going to do them a little bit differently. And so if you don't necessarily go really deep on any of them, again, that's okay. You can build this up over time. You don't have to just day one know how every single architecture works at a fundamental level. Pick an architecture, ask questions about it, check out sample repos, play with it, see how it works, and just have that in your tool belt ready to go. Then if you go to a team and they're using MVVM, but you're using MVP, you still have a lot of great experience to draw from. You'll still understand why these architectures are used, what the benefits of them are, and a lot of the rest just becomes implementation details that you can learn as you go. When I reached out to the Twitterverse, I got several nods for sharing what you know being an amazing tool to helping you start out your career. Whether you're just starting out or you've been an Android developer for years, your experience and perspectives are absolutely worth sharing. And I often get people that say they want to share, but they don't have anything interesting to say, or the topic they're interested in talking about has been covered before. And I think my best piece of advice is to share it anyways. Just the fact that it's you talking about something or writing about something, that makes it unique. And that unique perspective could be exactly what is needed to help one person out there understand the topic. Now, you could document your process, how you solved bugs, an interesting idea or an implementation that you had, your struggles and triumphs with a new tool or library, or really anything. And your audience could be your future self. It could be a very specific, person that's just starting out in their career. It could be the entire Android community, new developer, experienced developer, whatever. But there is always going to be someone out there that can benefit from what you have to share. So I think this tweet from Craig Russell sums it up really nicely. There's so many things that you experience on your day-to-day useful that would probably be beneficial to somebody out there. So if you want to document that and you have that desire to share others to help increase your own understanding, definitely do it. It's very, very worthwhile. I definitely know from my experience that I used to think that same thing. I didn't think I had anything worth sharing, or I was really worried about people pointing out that I was wrong or that my approach was a terrible one, which rarely happens. And when it does, I'm honestly happy about it because that means I'm learning. And I think that when you can reframe that and recognize that you don't need to prove anything to anybody, if you're sharing because you want to learn yourself, you want to help others learn, then even if there are a negative comment, a lot of times that becomes a learning opportunity. There's also so many positive comments that come out of it, and people are really supportive of that. And so I highly encourage you to do it. It's a great way to learn, and I think you'll get a lot out of it. We talked about a number of things already, and these were some of the ideas that popped up multiple times. There was also a pretty high number of just random one-off challenges that people had, which to me was not surprising, because like I said at the beginning, there is a wide range of things that are really hard to learn or challenging to deal with as you are starting in your career or even as you're progressing through your career. This doesn't necessarily go away. There's always stuff to learn. There's always things to struggle with and to overcome. So a few of these challenges are things like not letting job requirements deter you from applying to a job. If you see a job that looks interesting and you meet a lot of the requirements, don't stop yourself from applying just because you don't go down the list and check every single one. My first job, I did not check all the requirements. I only checked one requirement, and ultimately I ended up getting that job. And so I definitely recommend, just taking that chance. You have very little to lose by sending out that job application, and you might get this awesome new job that you're excited about. I think another big challenge is when you're getting into that first role of learning to work within a team. A big part of this, I think, is planning out your work. If you're working in kind of an agile methodology, whether that's Scrum or something else, you're often asked with breaking down your tasks, planning out their work for the sprint. Maybe that's a week, 2 weeks, 3 weeks, whatever. And that's a big challenge when you're first starting out. If you're coming straight out of school, your sprint was maybe the entire semester, and you just have to have this done by the end. And you weren't necessarily breaking things down into small, manageable chunks. If you were, awesome, you were probably a better student than I was. I certainly didn't. And so learning to accurately break that stuff down, I think, is a challenge. It helps, I think, to look at the complexity of a task rather than the time, and try and only take on so much complexity during a certain time span. Give yourself room for the unexpected. Talk with your team, your coworkers, your manager. Have this ongoing process, ongoing conversation about how you can improve that. And then practice estimating what you think a task is going to take in terms of time and effort. And then at the end, once it's done, compare that to what you expected. And over time, you'll learn to understand how much work you can get done in a given amount of time. I also really want to highlight this tweet right here, because it's okay to not code outside of 9 to 5. Perfectly okay, 100%. So easy to think that you need to be coding non-stop. We see that at t-shirts from conferences. We see this culture where everybody is constantly writing about what they're doing or talking about the work, and it's very easy to get caught up and think you need to be doing the same or you are going to get left behind. I really encourage you to give yourself a break. Give yourself space to relax, to decompress. There's always going to be work out there. You can't know it all, and you can't function well if you are burnt out. And so I really encourage you to give yourself the freedom, the self-compassion to not put the pressure on yourself to know it all, to do it all, to try it all. That does not define your value as an engineer, and you will be perfectly okay and probably much happier in the long term if you don't code 24/7. Whew, that was a lot. The Android ecosystem is constantly evolving, and it is absolutely overwhelming at times, especially if you're just starting out. But learning to accept that change, manage it, and actually embrace it can really set you up for long-term learning, growth, success, and hopefully a more balanced, happy work-life balance. So how can you manage and embrace that change? I think for me, it comes down to really 3 main things: curiosity, self-compassion, and the community. Be curious, seek out answers, ask questions, explore topics that you're interested in, explore solutions that will make your work easier. There's so much out there, and that's part of why there's so much change, is because progress is constantly being made to improve our lives as developers and to improve the platform as a whole. On the flip side of that, avoid putting pressure on yourself to learn, know, and try everything. You can't do it, nobody can, and it's a quick road to burnout if you try and put that pressure on yourself. You can be a great developer without having tried the latest and greatest 24/7. And finally, the community. The developer community is such an awesome resource. It can be a source of information, support, validation, friendships. It can be really almost anything you need it to be, but it only works if you engage with it. And I highly encourage you to do that if you aren't already. Whether that's on social media or even just following blogs, podcasts, weekly newsletters, there's just so much awesome opportunity out there for you to learn and grow by interacting with others in some way. The other big thing that I think is invaluable about the developer community is that it can be a source of support, validation, and mentorship. I think when you are starting out in your career, oftentimes it's hard to find that mentorship that is kind of just provided by default when you get into that first role. And so I really encourage you, if you are learning, or maybe you're in that first role but you're not getting that mentorship in your current team, to seek out other people around you or online and ask them questions. If you are struggling to learn a topic, seek out advice for that topic. If you're not sure how to get your teammates to listen to you, seek out advice on how to handle that. There's so many people out there with just a wealth of knowledge, information, and wisdom to share. And so you can kind of build up that tribe of mentors from the developer community, and that will really, really help you take off as both just a developer, a software engineer, and oftentimes you can just grow even as a person, which is probably even more important. This is a topic that I am really, really passionate about because I remember what a challenge it was to start off learning Android and both starting a career. And so I really want to find ways to help that process become easier for others. So if you like this video and you want to share it out with people, please do. Please leave a comment below about what your biggest challenges have been, whether that's with Android, working in a team, starting your career. I'd love to continue that conversation and build on this so more people can see these challenges, these struggles, and to recognize that they're not alone and that there's a lot of people out there willing to help. Thank you so much for watching. Until next time.